Everyone, thank you so much for being here. I'm Dr. Fiona Vernal from the University of Connecticut, one of the conveners of the Hartford Lecture Series. We appreciate you taking a little bit of your time to be here. This is the second of our lectures, Hot Summers in the City, Hartford's Urban Unrest, 1967 to 1969. I'd like to take this time to thank my co-organizer, Jeff Partridge, from Capitol, and to thank our sponsors, CT Humanities. Again, we really wanted to make sure that our lecture series has the farthest reach, and so it was really important for us to have ASL accompaniment tonight. So thank you so much for helping us with that. Our tonight's speaker is Elena Rosario. She is a local Hartfordite. She's a Puerto Rican public historian and a PhD candidate in history at the University of Michigan and a visiting fellow at Harvard University. Her current project documents the history of Puerto Rican tobacco migration, settlement, and community formation in 20th century Hartford. As a public humanities scholar, she uses in-depth archival research and community-centered methodologies to produce public-facing materials, such as a place-based K-12 lesson plan that foregrounds the experiences of Puerto Ricans in the state. I have been working on a couple of projects with Elena, and it's been my pleasure as someone who's also working on migration in Hartford to know that the little cohort of scholars who are interested in this topic is growing. And I hope to welcome future graduate students who are interested in this topic. Hartford is a tiny city, and we can accommodate a lot of people working on tobacco, working on migration, working on Caribbean and Puerto Rican history. So if any of you out there are on this live stream, we welcome one and all. If anyone out there has any ideas or would like to participate in this series, we welcome you. Please be in touch with me or Jeff or Mariana. This evening, Elena is going to share with us some excerpts from her dissertation research. So let's give a warm round of applause for our speaker, Elena.
Let me just set a timer because, yeah. Okay. All right, 40 minutes. All right. Thank you so much, Fiona, for that introduction. As Fiona already said, my name is Elena Rosario. I am a public historian, and my research primarily focuses on 20th century U.S. history, specifically the history of Connecticut, and more specifically the history of Hartford. And I was born and raised here in Hartford. I want to start this talk a little differently than I had planned to, and a little differently than I start most of my academic talks, but I do feel like this is supposed to be a public talk, and I'm in my city, so I'm going to be honest with you guys. I just had a panic attack about 15 minutes ago, and I'm here right now, and I'm doing the best that I can, but this is not going to be probably my best presentation, so please come back and see me again. It'll be a long process. But I want to start by claiming that because when we are in spaces that are not meant for us, sometimes we have panic attacks. And being someone born and raised in Hartford and thinking of the legacy of a place like this, right, the legacy of the Amistad in this room and all of that overcame me today. So I'm trying my best. I might have some moments of up and down, but we're here. So as Fiona mentioned, what I'm going to be talking about today is a part of a larger project that I've been working on for the last several years. That's my dissertation, which is called Puerto Rican Hartford, A Public History. And in that, I am really trying to do two things. One, document the rich history of Puerto Rican migration in Hartford in the 20th century. And the second thing is make sure that students that go through the K-12 system in Connecticut don't have the same experiences that I have which is that they're not represented in their, historical material. And so to do that, I not only am doing extensive archival research in local, state, and national archives, but I'm also really doing community-based projects, writing curriculum, as Fiona mentioned, doing oral histories, and participating in a lot of other public events to just make sure that as we're retelling this history, it's the most inclusive and accurate version that it could be. So the title of my presentation today is Hot Summers in the City, Hartford's Urban Unrest from 1967 to 1969. I just want to say that I stopped it in those 3 years because those are the most 3 summers of unrest, but the rebellions really go up until the 70s, so you could really kind of extend this project even longer. But as you will see, there's so much information to pack just within those 3 summers that I was unable to do that at this point. So similar to larger urban cities in America throughout the mid-20th century, Hartford's residents fought for political representation, access to better housing, bilingual education, as well as desegregated schools, and other reasons for the city to accurately represent the population. When Puerto Rican migrants first arrived in Hartford, they entered the racialized landscape of the city, and most of them settled in what we know today as the city's North End neighborhoods. Specifically, if you are from the area, today we're going to be specifically talking about the Clay Arsenal neighborhood. By the late 1960s, many of the city's Black and Puerto Rican residents lived in the North End. Occupying the same spaces, North End residents of color often leveraged their shared experience in the city to organize for the betterment of themselves and their community. This lecture will build off of the scholarship on Black rebellions by scholars such as Elizabeth Hinton and Chris Hayes, as well as be a part of the expanding body of literature of Latinx or Latina uprisings by scholars such as Lana Barber, Pedro Relago, and Joana Fernandez. I aim to help to bridge these 2 bodies of scholarship, which are often taught in 2 separate conversations, to help us understand these 3 summers of unrest in Hartford. Most of you might be kind of wondering why I'm using rebellion or uprising and not riot. And so I just instead of me paraphrasing, I'm just going to tell you exactly why I did it based on this other brilliant scholar who is at Yale right now. And so Elizabeth Hinton says, and I quote, "The so-called urban riots from the 1960s to the present can only be properly understood as rebellions. These events did not represent a wave of criminality, but a sustained insurgency. The violence was in response to moments of tangible racism, or a single incident, as Johnson said, almost always taking the form of a police encounter." And I'll end the quote there, but if you're interested in learning more, this is one of the most extensive histories of Black rebellions, so you can check it out. And so that's why I'm using Hartford rebellions instead of riots in this context. So previous accounts of these turbulent summers have often focused on Hartford's Black residents or Hartford's Puerto Rican residents as two separate groups. What I'm trying to do in my chapter that this draws from is bridge these 2 groups' experiences together to help us understand a more multiracial and ethnic history of Hartford, and specifically of the North End of Hartford. At the same time, because this history is not as documented, I'm also trying to show Puerto Rican participation in these moments of direct action. And this was really important because the current, what we call in academic circles is historiography, which is like the study of history, the kind of literature of history. And so in the current academic understanding of Puerto Rican participation in urban rebellions in the 1960s, most people have pointed to 1969. And what I'm trying to do with this chapter and with this lecture is kind of say that we have some moments actually a lot earlier than that we can point to. And I think if we do point to those, then we actually really show a longer history of Black and Puerto Rican organizing in the city that is often not talked about. So several scholars have demonstrated how urban rebellions are often they often start from a particular incident or a moment, and then which the community responds. And that is pretty much true for all the instances that I'm going to be talking about today. During 1967 to 1969, there was about a dozen documented disturbances in the city that ended in arrest and or violence. Oops, I went ahead, sorry. And I'm not going to go into every single one, but I'm happy to talk more about them in the Q&A. And on the screen here are a few maps from Dr. Bernal's Hartford Bound project, which we learned a little bit about last week. And these maps just kind of show you the region that we're talking about and the concentrations between the two populations that I'm mentioning. All right, sorry. On a relatively quiet evening in July of 1967, a 24-year-old Black man named William Tolles was arrested at the Battles Luncheonette, which was located at 1872 Main Street, which is present-day Save-A-Lot Plaza on Main Street, for those who want to know where we are. The restaurant was owned by Adam Battles, another local Black man who owned several businesses in the city. The incident began after Tolles allegedly used bad language at the lunch counter and was then asked to leave. When he was asked to leave, he also allegedly cursed at the owner and several servers. During Battle's arrest, there were several bystanders that protested the excessive force of police, which led a group of them to walk down to the Hartford Police Department that night. And eventually a few people, about a dozen or so people, took to the streets. During the first night, about 6 North End businesses were damaged by bricks, bottles, and Molotov cocktails, including 2 businesses owned by Adam Battles. One was the Battles Medicine, and the other was the Battles Luncheonette. While I was doing research at the Hartford Public Library, I discovered several photos in the Hartford Times photo collection, which, if you haven't seen, have some of the best photos of Hartford during the 20th century. And I found a couple pictures from the 1967 rebellions. One of the images that I found is this one on the screen here of the broken window. And if you look closer up here, which I don't know if you'll be able to, yeah, you can see up here, it actually says Battles. So this is an image of that window being broken of the luncheonette where the incident started, which is really cool that we have an actual photograph of that, because oftentimes you don't have photographs or evidence of some of these events. In the days that followed, several community meetings were held, and city officials, as well as Black community leaders, were trying to make sense of what these disturbances were, what was happening in the North End. At the time, these types of disturbances were happening in bigger cities all across the US, but people were just like, why is it happening in Hartford? They weren't sure. The newspaper kind of was making it seem like they just happened out of nowhere and there was no context. But as upon further research, it becomes evident that this was a local matter that was compounded by longstanding grievances. What was happening at the time is that there was a kind of disruption between more established Black leaders and younger Black organizers, and the differences between people wanting to do more direct action versus indirect action. And that's a very, not great summary of that, but essentially there were some differences there. One of the biggest Black leaders at the time was Reverend Richard Battles, which was the brother of Adam Battles. And he said to newspapers that the local teenagers were encouraged to riot by other black leaders who were kind of wanting to start stuff. And he particularly pointed to John Barber, who we will talk about in a little bit. Overall, most people saw this as a long-standing struggle between particular leadership, like as I said, established leadership versus those interested in more direct action rather than civil resistance. This three-day rebellion marked the start of a series of multiple summers of unrest that would occur. This is also the only rebellion that I'm going to talk about that I haven't found any proof of Puerto Rican participation in. By 1967, however, a new group called the Black Caucus had formed in Hartford, started by three men named Elmer Marshall, Joseph Williams, and John Barber. The group aimed to create a space where Hartford residents could consider various approaches to political representation and social problems in the city, particularly through direct action. Their first demonstration occurred on September 10th, following the shooting of a black teenager named William Furbush by a white police officer. On September 13th, several members of the Black Caucus walked to police headquarters to call for the suspension of the police officers. However, their calls were ignored. The following evening, Black Caucus leaders led a march of about 100 Black and Puerto Rican residents to the headquarters of the police department again. This second march was more widely covered in the newspaper because of its size, and the picture on the screen here is from one of those newspaper images. The co-founder of the Black Caucus, John Barber, continued to call for the police officer, Thomas Gainley, to be fired, but the police chief refused. And so the Black Caucus held a sit-in at the Hartford Police Department. Eventually, to kind of disperse the demonstrators, the Hartford Police Department called in the director of the Human Rights Commission to smooth things over, and he eventually said that he would arrange a meeting between the Black Caucus members and the mayor, and so that was the kind of end of the sit-in for the night. However, with the promise of that meeting unmet, the Black Caucus continued into a third night of marching. And so on the third night, they marched to City Hall as well. And this is really important because what we're going to see later in the rebellions is that the Hartford Police Department gets more aggressive, but they also get really militarized in terms of the way that they shut down the North End and the way that they kind of actively stop people from coming into downtown. And so the fact that they were in downtown is really important. So I just want to make point to that. And so that Friday evening, John Barber led about 20 Puerto Rican marchers from Main Street, and they met up with about 40 or so other black demonstrators on the steps of Hartford City Hall. There, Barber tacked up two penciled notes. The first one was in English, and it said, quote, "Mayor, where are you when we come to you in pain, crying for the suffering, afraid, and brutalized of this city, black and white and Spanish?" The second note was written in Spanish, but unfortunately, the memo's contents were not listed in the newspaper, and as of now are lost to history, but I'm still searching for them. The paper does say that it was not a direct translation, which I find very interesting, because then I'm wondering what the like Spanish-speaking protesters wanted to say, so we can kind of spectate on that. Either way, afterward, this multi-ethnic group and multilingual group, as we now know, marched to the police headquarters because the mayor refused to speak to them. During the demonstration at the police headquarters, several people were arrested for obstructing a public place. and a few were held on bond. 2 other demonstrators were held on an even larger bond and charged with breach of peace and resisting arrest. After this, things kind of cooled down a little bit. Sorry. On September 18th, so after the weekend, things settled down, which is kind of interesting instead of on the weekend. But by Monday, the Black Caucus had refocused its agenda towards better access to housing for Black and Puerto Rican residents in the city. They organized a peaceful march that was supposed to go from the predominantly white south, that was supposed to go from the north end to the predominantly white south end. However, it was stopped still in the north end with over 25 arrests. Black Caucus members and Hartford residents this time were joined by white allies from 2 groups called the Connecticut Committee for Nonviolence Action, headquartered in Voluntown, Connecticut. For those of you who don't know, that is a town in Connecticut that I've learned a lot about now. And AIM, the American Independence Movement, which was a group out of New Haven. I point to these 2 groups because I find it very interesting there was not really any evidence of white participation among Hartford residents, but we had white participation among people from Voluntown and New Haven, which I find very interesting. So just putting that there for us to kind of think about more. This group of almost 200 people made their way towards downtown, but eventually people that were not affiliated with the organizers started throwing bottles. As things got tensed, John Barber told the crowd, quote, "This is not the Black Caucus. We wanted a peaceful demonstration only." He asked everyone to cool it and reminded the demonstrators of their goal, but by this point, the kind of demonstration had speared off into different directions. Someone in the crowd yelled, quote, "We didn't come here for speeches," end quote. As the demonstrators from the Black Caucus tried to continue and other folks started throwing bottles, Hartford police in riot gear were on high alert. The police captain told Barber and other leaders that if they couldn't control the crowd, he would intervene. There was as we know, Barber was trying to control the crowd, but eventually it got out of hand and almost 40 police officers blocked the group before they could get to downtown, ordering them to disperse. Even though the marchers had never reached the south end, if they had, there was an angry crowd of white South End residents there that awaited them, which is interesting and will foreshadow us to a couple things that are going to happen later. Among the group of those arrested, the group consisted mostly of teenagers and people in their teens and 20s. It was both genders. There were men and women in the group, and at least 4 people arrested had Spanish surnames. And so I'm still trying to figure out and piece together participation, but that's kind of what we know, at least for now. The following day, the Black Caucus attempted again to march to the south end. This time, 300 policemen in riot helmets sealed off the north end before you could get to downtown. So for those of you who know the north end of Hartford, where we're talking about it being sealed is actually, ironically, is kind of where the current safety complex is. It's a little before that, where you have the kind of intersection of Main and Albany, a little past that on High Street. That's actually where they were getting blocked, which is now our current safety complex. Very interesting to think about in place-based history. Around 100 people at this time, a lot of incidents of rock throwing and bottle throwing were reported, and several businesses were damaged. Police responded by deploying tear gas into the crowd, but they also threw tear gas into apartment buildings. One of the apartment buildings that they threw tear gas into was in Bellevue Square, and it had to be evacuated. And so as you're starting to see, as the disturbances are getting more and more, they're getting more people involved, the police are reacting in more violent and kind of active ways. 2 men were also charged with inciting a riot. One of them was named George Foster Bay. This is really interesting because in one version of this history by a historian, they talk about George Foster Bay being arrested because that's in the newspaper. But I found through oral history that a different story about why he was arrested. So I'm going to tell you right now. And this is why I think it's important to always, even though the newspaper has been a primary source for me, we also have to question the newspaper and question sources. And so even though the newspaper lists George as an inciter of the riot, one bystander from the rebellions said that he was actually a community organizer. He worked for the community renewal team, and he was trying to stop people. And him and also other organizers in the city that were members of the Black Caucus or the North End Community Action Group or the Black Panthers were also trying to stop people. And so there was a moment in which George sees a young man try to throw a brick, and he takes the brick from the young man, and the bystander says that at that moment that George is holding the brick, a Hartford Current news reporter takes a picture of George with the brick. So if I never found that other oral history, I would just be like, wait, George was a community organizer, but he incited the riot, and I would have not been able to kind of piece that together, which I found very interesting. So I wanted to put that in there as an example of why oral histories are important, and also why even when we're doing this research, it's important to constantly question what we're finding out. I was also able to find some images of Puerto Ricans in the disturbances. I don't have them up here today, I apologize, but they were really interesting. On the third night of the rebellions, police also used tear gas again, and protesters tried to get to meet with the mayor. The mayor finally invited members of the Black Caucus to Hartford City Hall on September 21st. And one of the things that is really interesting at this point is that this is the first time also on September 21st when this particular group gets now called it gets called a Black and Puerto Rican group in the newspaper for the first time. So I'm like, wait a second, what's going on here? And so I thought that was a really interesting moment. And this is this is the first time we see Puerto Ricans named as stakeholders in the Black Caucus. Members of the Black Caucus meet with a bunch of city representatives and other groups, and among the things that they say, there's some really important things that I think are important for us to think about organizing in the North End as a multi-ethnic and multiracial space. So one of the members of the Black Caucus said specifically that the North End needed a self-help center. And they wanted this to come through this community renewal team, which was already an organization doing the work. However, they said the community center needed to be in the North End, quote, where the poor Black and Puerto Ricans can run it, not the rich white man's area, end quote. Other people also spoke at this meeting about the different ways that police and the city were not actually supporting Puerto Ricans in becoming active members of the city, and so they brought up language as an important factor here, which is again very key to thinking about this as a multilingual space as well. And so these 3 days of unrest in September of 1967 for me, mark a significant moment in coalition building in Hartford's North End and show solidarity among Hartford's Black and Puerto Rican residents in tackling the realities of a mid-sized urban city. Surprisingly, though, a lot of this has not been documented in terms of thinking about these groups together. However, on September 29th, the Black and Puerto Rican Caucus finally was able to make its march to the South End. And I did find several sources that do call it the Black and Puerto Rican Caucus. However, I'm still trying to figure out more information on that. So if anybody knows anything, please let me know. I'm going to kind of speed ahead now because my time is running out. It's just so much information that I want to share. So I'm going to skip ahead and say, just so you know, by the time they did make it into the South End, they were met with boos and spectators throwing rocks and bottles and a lot of hostility. And that march was peaceful, quote unquote. It did end. However, 2 white men were arrested for disobeying police orders. And so, as far as I know, the caucus continued to advocate for better housing through the fall, but I'm still conducting more research to see how the group kind of expands. In 1967, switching things up a bit, in 1967, President Lyndon B. Johnson established the Kerner Commission, which created a report that a lot of scholars draw on. This 1968 report famously concluded that the nation was, quote, moving toward 2 societies, one black and one white, separate and unequal, end quote. This is important because it's kind of the context in which the people have been thinking about, scholars have thought about these rebellions. And so Hartford is cited in here 3 times, but there's no mention of any Puerto Rican participation, which I think is really interesting because the archives clearly show that at the time they were writing about Puerto Rican participation, but whoever collected the data from that to put it in the commission doesn't talk about Puerto Rican. And the commission in general doesn't really mention any Latine. It really lacks a lot of that in general. Anyways, so now we're in 1968 in Hartford. In April of 1968, the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King is assassinated, which leads to Hartford's next big instance of a multi-day unrest. Again, I don't have that much time, so I'm going to skip ahead. I apologize. The main thing to know about that particular moment was that it was mostly youth-led, a lot of youth from Weaver High School. And the city did see a few months of small-scale disturbances in July and June as well. But there really wasn't another big kind of violent moment in the North End until August 9th and 10th of 1968. These particular disturbances are probably the least archived that I found, and so I've only been able to find a handful of sources that document them. But what I've been able to piece together is that on August 9th, several North End teenagers threw rocks, bottles, and concrete at police cruisers who were over-policing and over-surveilling on Florence Street. These disturbances led to the injuring of 6 police officers. And although it was a very small group of people that participated in it, police used excessive tear gas in the community. And so what you see is as folks are taking to the streets more and more and figuring out ways to demonstrate, the city is reacting more and more and actually kind of bringing in bystanders. And so these multiple disturbances in '68 were both a result of local as well as national events, but still they show us that Hartford residents were able to transform their personal and communal anger into social action. And so the pictures of the screen you see here, one is of of the rebellions, and the police are kind of standing outside of one of a building where they think people are supposed to be in, throwing things at them. The other image up here is of a demonstration from the teacher strike, and this is just to point that while this talk is focusing on particular moments of destruction, I don't want to say violence, right? Because as we insurgency, there were not as invasive or more passive forms of demonstrations happening, like the teacher strike or sit-ins and other forms. So there's tons of stuff happening. All right. I'm gonna run out of time. I'm sorry. Okay. So I give you all this information because by 1969, the city has already seen 2 summers of unrest. The police are kind of ready for whatever's gonna happen. And what ends up happening is what I say is a contention of public space. And so what was happening was, police were over-policing the spaces, and they were charging people with loitering, excessive charges like arrest. And so what ends up happening in the summer of '69 is there's a lot of community organizers, so the Black Panthers do street patrols, other groups do street patrols, and there's a lot of work in the community to try to figure out what happened in the past disturbances and how can we, change things. But really, the tension just continues. On June 2nd, 1969, there's another police cruiser that gets attacked. This time it gets set on fire in Bellevue Square. And police, again, continue to kind of, at this point, they just mark off the north end. And so what ends up happening is, as they mark off the north end and they continue to use tear gas and other excessive force, the residents, especially residents that were not participating in the rebellion, start to get more involved in the long-term organizing that was already occurring, as we already see. About a week later, a group of Puerto Rican residents in Hartford give a list of demands to the mayor. Many of the demands were actually demands that were given previously in May to the governor. And so in May of 1969, 15 Puerto Rican leaders delivered a list of demands to the governor of Connecticut. In this list, the reason why they delivered this letter originally was because a radio broadcasted that, quote, Puerto Rican types kidnapped a white man in a Connecticut suburb outside of Hartford. It was later found out the kidnappers were not Puerto Rican, but also the use of the language on this statewide scale was the final straw for Puerto Ricans. And so they made this list of demands, and they gave it to the mayor, they gave it to the governor. Nothing happened. They saw what was happening in Hartford, and then they gave the demands again to the to the mayor. Hartford residents then tell the mayor, you already knew what our problems were, so you better start doing something. And so nothing ends up happening, as you can probably see the way that a lot of these things happen. Nothing happens at that time. And what does kind of boil over into this long summer of Puerto Ricans feeling unrepresented by the political establishment, but also not even being listened to, is another event on August 10th, 1969, which is known as the Comacheos rebellions. And this rebellion starts when a Puerto Rican man is assaulted by a white motorcycle gang member from this gang called the Camachos, who was in Frog Hollow. And so Puerto Rican community leaders go and they want the guy arrested. He doesn't get arrested. Nobody gets arrested for days and days and days. And so Puerto Ricans end up leading a riot for the first time in '69. And one Puerto Rican employee of the Poor People's Federation said, quote, "The presence of Puerto Rican adults on the street was a show of unity in the face of unequal treatment," end quote. And so this is interesting because a lot of the other rebellions we talk about are teens and 20s, but when we get into these in the 1960s, in the late 1960s, these are actually, you get some people in their late 30s are also participating as well. And so it gets to be a more multi-generational movement, which I think is really fascinating. Okay, I gotta go. I gotta wrap this up. Skip ahead. Okay. So eventually there's a community meeting held. The meeting is held by someone who is near and dear to any Puerto Rican in Hartford knows this name. The meeting was led by Maria Colon Sanchez, who at the time was on the Democratic Town Committee. And it was also interesting because in the other rebellions that I've been tracking, it's been really hard to figure out like who were the Puerto Rican leaders. But in this moment, you have someone like Maria Sanchez, who was involved in more political conversations, also coming up and speaking up for some of the youth and some of the other people that were not getting as much political attention. And one of the things she said, which is kind of where the talk gets the quote from, is that she told local newspapers that, quote, "If something isn't done or no good statement is made quickly, it could be a hot weekend," end quote. So I have to go super fast, but essentially things were pretty bad. A lot of people in the community meetings talked about police specifically targeting Puerto Ricans. They actually targeted anyone who looked Puerto Rican. They arrested anyone that was speaking Spanish. So you have a lot of instances that happen. One of the things that also happens during these demonstrations is that a Puerto Rican man named Ramon Rivera, who was walking from a nearby restaurant, was shot by Hartford police. This shooting ends up being protested by some of the only Puerto Rican police officers on the job who observed the incident, and they end up getting punished for and barred from further duty and put under review because they protest the shooting of their peers. And so this is really, and then all this happens, and then a week goes by, and then the police finally announce that they arrested someone in connection with the beating of the unarmed Puerto Rican man. Still, the case of the two Puerto Rican police officers who protested the tactics used by their fellow officers, case went on until the next year, and they did end up facing repercussions at work. I don't have any time to go into the last set of rebellions that occur, but they're kind of the most important, so I'll be really, really brief with you. On August 31st, the Hartford Times newspaper published a new article. And it was supposed to be a series on Puerto Ricans in Hartford. And this was not new. Newspapers did it all the time. But as you know, all these rebellions had just, that was my timer. All the rebellions had just occurred. And so the newspaper reporter, which is also odd because in the previous iterations, they always kind of interviewed people. But for this particular article, the reporter did not interview any Puerto Ricans. And he decided that the first article was going to talk about Puerto Rican migration and settlement in the city and interview non-Puerto Ricans about what they thought. And so A Hartford firefighter who worked in the South End told the Times, quote, "They're pigs. That's all, pigs. They dump garbage out their windows. They live like pigs," end quote. Another person was quoted in this article, a South End resident, who said, quote, Puerto Rican men, quote, "insult women on the street and, quote, they ought to go back to hell where they came from," end quote. So we can see these comments now and be like, oh my God, why would you publish that a couple weeks after the rebellions? Mr. Ryan did not see that. So what ends up happening is another series, probably the biggest set of disturbances the city sees in the time period, which are known as the Labor Day rebellions. There's two things that are happening at the same time. So that happens on August 31st. On September 1st, West Hartford police kill an unarmed black Hartford high school student. And so what ends up happening is the collective anger of two communities, the black and Puerto Rican community, specifically in the North End, come together in this moment in '69, which is very interesting. And that's kind of why I wanted to show this longer history of, if we tell these stories separately, it's very easy to forget where people intersect. It's very easy to think leaders come out of nowhere. It's very easy to say we did it all ourselves, but if you actually end up connecting some of these stories and seeing it over time, you can see how some of these moments are tied together, and they actually tell us a kind of rich history, a place-based history of the North End. And so my time is up, but I just want to say that there's so many different ways that I could have gone into talking about these rebellions, and there's many consequences and kind of results that happen after that. For those of us who live in the city, we see some of the tangible results of, you know, the fact that the North End was without a library or cleaners or a grocery store for a long time. So we see some of those things, but I want to also draw our attention to some of the positive things that came out of these moments. And so there was a lawsuit brought by the NAACP and a Puerto Rican organization called La Casa de Puerto Rico that did address the police behavior in the 1969 rebellions, particularly addressing their use of tear gas, dogs, and unequal police protection in the North End neighborhood. And so as a result, there was kind of a federal investigation, and eventually the NAACP and La Casa de Puerto Rico received their own complaint forms that residents would be able to file police reports through those two organizations and not have to go to the police department. And those forms were backed by federal orders, so they had the same weight if they were taken by a police officer. And city officials also prohibited the police department to use tear gas in residence or in the presence of children. That should have already been, but we got that too. Another thing that we get is something that I was able to find through archival research, which is in 1969, Hartford Public Schools publishes a curriculum called Discovering Puerto Rico. And this curriculum, I found, comes directly out of the demands listed by Puerto Ricans during all these rebellions. And I was able to find that because I found the list of demands at the Center for Puerto Rican Studies. I found the story in the newspaper, and then I found the curriculum in my parents' basement in Hartford. So I'm going to end here by saying when you're doing this type of research, you need to do it very extensively everywhere. Talk to everybody you know. Look under the floorboards, and hopefully it won't take us another 50 or 60 years to be able to tell these more inclusive stories. Thank you. Yeah, so I'm trying to tie that history. It's funny because I don't know why, but I haven't been able to find like a history of the legislative Black and Puerto Rican caucus. So one, that history I have not been able to find. So I'm like, do I have to write that history? Because like maybe, but like even on their website, it just kind of says that they were started. You know, it's hilarious. That's at the end of my speech. I think it was started in 75. I gotta double check, but I wrote it down because I was like, this is a connection that I wanna make. I think there has to be a link there. I think the names are too similar, and the time frame is like less than 5 years. So I think in that way, there has to be, the conversation has to be there. I have not found direct links, however, between that. So yeah, I would just say, I hope that we can find those links. I would have to do more like long-term kind of deep research on the caucus, which again is a little bit out of the time frame that I've been studying. But I think they're definitely related. And I think it's important for us to not, I think a lot of academic scholars, as I said earlier, perceive, like when they think about 1960s rebellions, they perceive them as like one race or one group. And I think it's important for us to think about people that occupied multiple spaces. So another thing that I can't really tell from some of my research, but I'm pretty sure, is people that occupied both Black and Puerto Rican spaces and what was their role in the movement. And I think maybe that's one of the people that started that legislative caucus, but we don't know. We gotta look.
Thank you. Excellent presentation. I want to extend the gentleman's question. At that time, I think in the mid-60s, Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan, he wrote a book on the American family and actually the African-American family and the poverty. So I think, based on your presentation, the motivation for the Black population must be probably intrinsically different than from the motivation of the Puerto Rican family.
Yes, I think it's hard to say with any like big group of people, everyone's gonna, in a community, even among Puerto Ricans, as we saw, like not everyone had the same motivation or same experience. So I think, I don't wanna say like a blanket statement, but I do think in the case in Hartford, and specifically in the North End, we are looking at the way, like, and if we tell it through the lens that I'm trying to tell it, we're looking at the way the city treated the North End, right? I'm thinking about North End residents particularly. There's a way in which we have to then break it down racially and ethnically, but I think if we can just start by looking at these two groups as North End residents and what was their experience in the city as residents of that particular area, and how the city and particularly city officials interacted with people in that area, I think can lend us to see some of these similarities. Not that they were always gonna have the same exact motivation as we see in the September 69 rebellions. Puerto Ricans were mad about the Times article. Black folks were mad about the shooting. I'm sure there was a mix of people that were mad about both of them, and they kind of met together. But the actual overarching, when community meetings were happening, what people are asking for is better housing, they're asking for better resources in the North End. And so I do think I think it's important for us to think about this as a place-based work, if that answers your question. Yeah.
And also, everybody who's watching online, do type your questions in the chat and we can get to them.
Quickly, do you know about the Hartford Current's photo morgue? I loved your pictures, and I think you can never have too many, but I haven't looked at it in a long time, and I hope it's still there, but it ought to be in the public domain at some point. Do you know anything about that? And then secondly, I'm curious about the demographics of the police force at the time.
I have seen some of those images. They're not as, a lot of the Hartford Times photo collection has been digitized on the Connecticut Digital Archive, and so I think those are more accessible, so I often use those more for presentations because they're already kind of in public domain. There are a lot of, the Hartford Current photos, I think they have, the Hartford History Center has a lot of those photos in different kind of, what they have, like, what were they called? Like their city files or like their demographic files, basically. There's like loose leaf photos. But I haven't like done an extensive kind of overview of those. I have found that the Times has been a little more, it seems to be a little more representative of communities of color. They have more writers. At the time, they have more writers that are of the group that they're writing about. I didn't get to talk about it, but in '69, you actually get the Hartford Times publishes in Spanish about the rebellion. So that's like super, super important and a super big moment. And the Current was not doing that.
Is that why they failed?
I don't know. I don't know. But yeah, so we'll see what happens. But and the second thing about your question was the police force at the time. I do not have the demographics for that. I should definitely know. I do know at the time that there were only 2 or 3 Puerto Rican officers at the time. So that I do know that, but I don't know the rest of the demographics. Sorry.
Thank you for this. I was here up on the hill at Trinity College during that period. A lot of things happened during the summer, so we weren't really aware of them. But some aspects we caught on to. One thing I'm interested in is kind of the impact of external forces on what was going on here. For instance, you mentioned the organizer from CRT. The Community Renewal Team was a federally funded community action agency. Your tax dollars at work. It's really interesting to think that somebody working for a federal agency was actually engaged in this direct action organizing in the city.
Well, he was trying to stop the rioters.
Yeah.
You know, so, but I do think that well, I'll let you finish, sorry.
Yeah. You mentioned CNVA, the Community for Nonviolent Action. That was kind of a big deal at the time. They were a group that was dedicated to nonviolent action, direct action. They were intensely involved in anti-nuke organizing, and I think also anti-Vietnam War organizing, and to have them kind of engaged was really an interesting piece of the story, I think. Plus, you know, the Black Panthers, they weren't just we had a pretty powerful Black Panther chapter here. Unfortunately, Butch Lewis died recently. He was amazing aspect of that. But anyway, keep going. Your story is wide and far-ranging. You're getting a good start, but it really it's going to go. There's a lot of personalities involved in that deserve to be described and remembered.
Yeah, for sure. So a lot of my oral histories have spoke to outside agitators. That like most of the people that I talk to mention outside agitators. There's not really, they can't really point to somebody necessarily, but they do say that there were moments where there was different people not from the community participating and or making the situation violent. So I think that was very common. Those two groups, the group from Voluntown and the group from New Haven, my understanding of how they became involved is that John Barber, while he was a Hartford business owner and did have a North End residence, also lived in New Haven, also had a really big connection to New Haven. And so I think, again, that I didn't even look at Waterbury or New Haven or all these other cities that were experiencing this at the same time, but I think if we went further and traced that out, we could see some of those networks that you're talking about. This is like the one part of my research, so I want to really talk about it and really do it well, but I haven't had as much time to focus on it because it's just like one moment in this long history that I'm telling from 1949 to 1973, so.
I think we have time for maybe 2 more questions.
I don't want to point you towards more things to research because I know you have plenty to do, but you're talking about youth involved in this, and the social media of the time was partially the underground newspapers, and I just wondered if you've gone out to the Dodd Center and gone through things there because they have such an extensive collection of the whole country's underground papers. And there isn't really, kind of like Trinity was that kind of a place, but certainly students at Trinity were reading these papers, like the Berkeley Barb and other things like that, and they're not as kind of prejudiced as the Current and the Times would have been. There's a lot of stuff about the Young Lords in there, for example, and so I would just be really interesting to see if you find things about Hartford in those papers.
I haven't, in terms of like just a broad search, I haven't done like extensive research at the dot, but I've done like a kind of overview, like internet kind of search to see what they have, and a lot of like of their digital archives. Hartford did have a lot of local newspapers. And so I've spent a lot of my energy trying to track down those rather than ones that are not Hartford, which is I probably need to do both. But so there was Spanish language periodicals. There were like the North End Agent was out at the time. And so, yeah, so that is a really good place to do some work. So thank you. I haven't done that, but I will definitely do it.
Thank you. So when we think of cities as sites of activism and resistance in this period, I think one of the catalysts for that resistance sometimes is the policies of urban renewal and displacement, and the building of highways through communities and tearing them apart. That's certainly true for many other cities in Connecticut and across the country. I'm wondering if you see that in Hartford as one of the kind of contributing factors or kind of underlying tensions that bubbles up in some of these rebellions you've been discussing.
Yeah, definitely. I think what's so important about for me to tell this story and try to tell this story in a way that eventually will be out of Hartford is to show that that Hartford, even though it is a mid-sized urban city, does offer some of the same explanations that we see from other cities like Detroit or or Newark. I also have. So yes, urban crisis, urban decline, the fact that 84 and 91 were built and split the city up. White flight was a huge thing that I did not mention at the time, like in my talk, but like that's there, there's a reason why as people are going into the South End, the people that have been there for a long time are kind of protesting that, because you see a lot of other white flight. So the white folks in the South End are fearful. They're like, wait, are we going to leave like everybody else? And so there's a lot of these tensions that are seen, you know, I think in a lot of other cities. I think the city itself was also going through extensive redevelopment. So you have in the 60s, you have like Constitution Plaza, you have like the Albany redevelopment, and right after the rebellions, you get, oh my God, what is it? Adrian's Landing comes out, you know, so I think it all plays a role. And if we had like 2 hours, I would, you know, tie it all in, but I'm glad that you're making those connections, and hopefully what we can do is show people that, you know, they can glean some of these experiences of other American cities out of Hartford, and what Hartford can offer that's different from these cities, being a predominantly Black and Caribbean and city. Thank you.
Thank you, Elena. Let's show our appreciation for our speaker. It was a wonderful presentation. Thank you very much. And thank you to all of you for coming tonight, and those of you online for joining us. I want to make sure everybody knows that we have our next event coming up in just 2 days. It's going to be a walking tour tracing the footsteps of Hartford's first Black church. It's going to begin right across the street and down a bit there at Center Church at 10 o'clock in the morning. We're going to hear from Andre Kitt, who's a community historian and a member of the church there, who's going to talk about the beginning of the African Religious Society that became the Talcott Street Church. And then we're going to walk over here to the old State House, and Mariana is going to talk to us about the Amistad trial and how the Talcott Street Church and the African Religious Society was involved in it. And then we're going to walk down Market Street, seeing pictures of what it used to look like in those days, and then we'll end up at the site where the Talcott Street Church stood. We're going to hear from someone from Faith Congregational Church there, which is the living continuation of that church. And then we're going to go to the Nutmeg Pulpit exhibit, which is at Capitol Community College, CT State Community College Capitol, just down the street. Which is my home, and we're going to be seeing the exhibit there on the Talcott Street Church. So we hope you'll join us Saturday at 10 o'clock, Center Church. Next week we have a Black Ecological Return to Charter Oak Terrace, a lecture by Shannon Miller. We hope you'll be here for that as well. Thanks so much for coming out tonight, and have a good evening.
Thank you.